All right, so we're going to talk about architecture anti-patterns, and one of the things I was highlighting is how much I love working with patterns, and particularly anti-patterns. How with anti-patterns, when you look at them, there's a sense of relief in that you're not alone. When you're in a situation that somebody else has been there, so much so that they've got it documented, they've labeled it. Anti-patterns, when you recognize that you're in that situation, provide you the information about what you need to change in order to solve that problem. Furthermore, anti-patterns can be a way of thinking and planning ahead so that you can protect yourself from ending up in that situation in the first place. So that's what we're going to try to show you in this webinar. If you have any comments or questions as I'm going through this, I appreciate the fact that immediately when you couldn't hear me, you were writing that into the question box. That's great. Raise your hand to get my attention. I'll do my best to keep an eye on that, but just know that at the end of the webinar, I'll stay online to be able to talk to any of you that have questions that you want to follow up on. My name is Christine Thompson, Architecture Lead. And I've already sent out my email address, and I'll do that again at the end of the webinar so that if you have any questions that come up later, you can feel free to drop me a line and I'll follow up with you through email. WebAge Solutions offers a wide range of training, and in all of that training that we have, there is a full curriculum for architects. So from enterprise architecture, solution architecture, and going down into the different domains like data and application and infrastructure training. We also provide TOGAF certified training, so for those of you that are looking to get certified, we can help you with that. If you're working in an organization that's leaning on TOGAF to support their framework for doing architecture, certainly learning more about TOGAF can help you be more successful in your organization. So lots of training that you can take a look at that could help you get more out of your architecture program. All right, so what are we going to talk about here? We have the architecture anti-patterns, so we're just going to introduce what is meant by anti-patterns and how all of this came about. And then we'll dive in and take a look at what's involved in working with anti-patterns. So we'll talk about the most common mistakes, and then ways in which to prevent failure. And when you look at the ways to prevent failure, it may be that you're kind of going, well, wait a minute, I don't know that I can actually do that because I don't have that kind of influence or power. So we're even going to address that. So when reality is not quite in sync with what the ideal or the prescription is, what else can you do? We'll finish by highlighting some things that, courses that you might be interested in as follow-up to be able to do more of this kind of work. All right, so if everybody is happy with it, just raise your hand saying that you're good. No questions or issues. Great. All right. So let's take a look at what we mean by anti-patterns. So here's basically, if you went onto Wikipedia, their definition. So it is a response, a common response to a recurring problem, kind of like the reverse of describing a pattern, which is a common response to a problem to actually get a successful result. This is a common response to a recurring problem that is proven to be ineffective. And that not only does it not solve the problem, but it actually creates its own set of problems. So notice that it is proven and repeatable ways to fail. And a key thing here to highlight that it's not just about having a bad habit or a bad idea, that there's other layers to it to qualify as an anti-pattern. Let's take a look at those. So when we look at the Gang of Four, I'm sure Most of you are familiar with them. They have the authors of Object-Oriented Design Patterns, one of the leading books in the whole discussion on patterns. And that to distinguish from a bad habit or just a bad idea, they highlight that you have to have two key elements for it to be an anti-pattern. So the first one here is that, as we can see here, that it's commonly used process, structure, or pattern of action. So a way that habitually that you're doing it, so again, not just a bad habit, but there is an element of that in there, that it seems like by doing this, that this would be good, but you're not getting the results back that you're hoping for, so you're getting a cost to it, so bad effects. And then moving it from the fact that you're just repeating sort of a bad approach is the fact that there actually is a proven way to do it well. So it's not really considered an anti-pattern unless there's actually a proven way to succeed at it. Clearly, if nobody else has been in a situation and you tried something and it failed, then you don't keep doing it the way that's proven to fail. You try a different thing. So maybe it was a bad idea, but it only qualifies as an anti-pattern if you're repeating this behavior when there's another option to take in order to get success. All right, so this is what I need you to have in your mind as we look at anti-patterns. Now, working with patterns in architecture, definitely we want to be as familiar as possible with all the patterns that are out there. If you're an architect that's just getting into working with patterns, you're going to start with patterns that are labeled as architecture patterns. You can also be working with integration patterns because a key part of architecture is about integrating different components and subsystems in order to build your system. So that's where you'd start, but we encourage when you're working with patterns to reinterpret patterns that may never have been for architecture, but because they're structural in nature can be reinterpreted to be architectural. An example of that would be looking at going back to the Gang of Four with their object-oriented design patterns. So these are design patterns for software. In there they have a whole section just on structural patterns. Two examples would be the facade pattern and proxy pattern. Well, we can apply the facade pattern and proxy pattern in business as a practice. It's not just about code. Certainly we can apply that at a solution architecture level as we try to integrate the different components across the different domains. So again, we have these well-documented patterns. Architecture frameworks are really good at pointing you in the right direction as to the different patterns to look at for different situations. And patterns themselves are the proven ways to succeed. So I've been in a situation and I can recognize the characteristics of the situation, and I know when I'm in a situation like this what to do. And just thinking of it on a personal level, how you can talk about, I know that in order to do well with my work in the morning, it's always recommended that I get to bed early enough to ensure I'm rested. So that is a pattern. And you know that an anti-pattern to that would be staying up too late and you're tired in the morning and you don't function well. That would be an anti-pattern because that's a recurring situation that you're in. You need to perform well in the morning, and that a proven way to be ready for that is to go to bed early, and you're choosing to stay up late, and if you repeat that, you've proven that this is a way not to be successful. So you get the idea of what we mean by patterns. And in architecture, we use this a lot. Working with patterns is part of our reference model when we identify components and how we expect them to be implemented. So patterns are a communication tool that as architects we hand over to those technical experts that are going to be implementing the various parts of our architecture. So it's a communication tool to get things done in the way that we want, part of a specification. So where do anti-patterns come into this? Because certainly you're not going to be sitting there saying, do this anti-pattern. What you want to do is say, don't do this anti-pattern. So when we look at architecture anti-patterns, we can talk about the fact that these are anti-patterns that are at the system level or enterprise level, focusing on the structure of our systems, the applications, the software elements, and the components that are building blocks for our architecture. And when we, again, look at those system levels, are there common problems that we face and ways that we've been handling it that we understand are actually not giving us the results that we want? If you're not getting the results back from your architecture, it's on you to stop and think about, well, what are we doing wrong that we're not getting back the value that we had expected? Of course, that brings in another element, that in order for me to actually detect that things aren't working means that once the architecture is in use, whether this is in our pilot phase of rolling it out or that it's actually in the executable realm, that it's now up and running in production, I have to be monitoring my architecture. So we want to make sure that part of the function of the architect is not just to say, I've addressed the architectural issues of this project, now I'm moving on to the next project, and I've forgotten about that other architecture. Architecture lives longer than a project, and that while it's up and running being used, I have to have a certain level of ownership over this architecture such that I can detect when it's not working properly. And that way I can then lean on anti-patterns to help me identify I'm recognizing this pattern of failure here. All right, so what are the most common mistakes? Let's take a look. I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you're well familiar or have a sense of what the anti-patterns you're experiencing at your organization. Raise your hand if you already have a sense, I have a feeling I know what anti-patterns are going to be brought up. Maybe put it in the question box as to what anti-pattern, if you're familiar with them, you're expecting to discuss on the next slide. Anybody care to volunteer? I see one here, not following the standard. Yeah. Can anybody else? Not planning. Yeah. Proven way to fail is just sort of flying by the seat of the pants. Okay. Are there any other ones that you're going, I'm experiencing this problem and I think it's an anti-pattern? That's a good one. Data warehouse used for operational decision making. Okay, tightly coupled systems. Yeah, going against sort of foundational silo development. Amen to that. Oh, you know what? I'm really curious. How many of you would say that you're in a project-driven architecture as opposed to having architecture drive projects? It's the other way around. Oh, thank you for that one, unsupported platform. So we're seeing a lot of things sort of frustrating us as architecture, and what we want to do is sort of step back and recognize that we're not alone. A lot of other organizations running their architecture programs are seeing the same thing, and some of those organizations have been successful in turning things around, and that's what we're going to look for in our anti-patterns. Okay, so, not looking in the future. Yeah, that's a good one. So just sort of looking at your feet and not really paying attention to where you want to go, not looking around. Excellent. All right, so let's take a look at a few of the ones that I've identified here. And a number of the comments that were made there, actually, you're going to be able to see, oh, that situation falls under this anti-pattern. Let's take a look at them. So the first thing is knowing that to really get the benefit of anti-patterns, you need, much like patterns, you need to become familiar with what has been documented, what have others actually done to solve the problems. So there are many sources available. So different anti-patterns for different types of architecture, and I was seeing certainly comments like that coming up, that there's definitely at an enterprise architecture level, the whole issue of sort of the silos, well, that's an enterprise architecture anti-pattern. And then the specific comment about using the data warehouse for operational activities, that was a really good one to highlight. And that's definitely more at the domain level. So we have different levels of architecture. There's going to be different groupings of anti-patterns. So when we look at this, that we have a lot of architecture programs. I can't think of any large organization that is not trying to some degree to do enterprise architecture. And when we look at enterprise architecture, that will typically be expressed in trying to align with the business across the different domains. So having applications and data systems and infrastructure working together to deliver on the business capability. And that we've been doing actively architecture. Well, one could argue that it's been around for as long as we've been doing computer, but formally as a discipline in the industry, the turn of the century was really the birthplace of this becoming as widespread. When we look at the frameworks, we see that government organizations, thinking of something like FEAF, Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework, or looking at DODAS, Department of Defense Architecture Framework, they were really stepping out in the 80s, early 90s to formalize this discipline. But across industries, we really saw it being picked up as an approach to really getting the most out of our IT systems so that our businesses could grow around the turn of the century. So we have well over a decade, if not 2 decades, of formalized information that we can lean on. And again, if you're familiar with these frameworks, a lot of them will point you to a collection of anti-patterns to pay attention to. All right, so let's take a look at some of the common enterprise architecture anti-patterns. So I've got a few slides on this. Let's take a look at the first one, buzzword-driven architecture. I'm seeing this happening right now. So something really cool is happening, and the powers that be typically are getting excited about it, and then all of a sudden they're prescribing, let's do it. They haven't really thought about, is this appropriate? And I think somebody had commented on one of the problems is not planning. Well, part of it would be that you need to actually stop and think and learn about it to see if and where this would fit. So that complaint about the planning might be expressed through, or the lack of planning might be expressed through buzzword-driven architecture. Are any of you right now in a situation where you've got this sort of announcement coming down, we're going to do this and everything's going to be this, because they're excited about something that's really cool, and you're sitting there kind of going, what are they talking about? And I don't see how that's going to work. How many of you are in that situation? Raise your hand or maybe add into the question dialog box if you see that happening. I've got one in mind that I'm hearing a lot about that to me is buzzword-driven architecture right now that's kind of hot. So what I've been hearing about, it reminds me, I got a flashback to the early 2000s when service-oriented architecture was coming on the scene and having been formalized and proven to work to solve a lot of problems. Organizations heard about it, and then they said everything's going to be SOA, right? We're going to have shared services everywhere. Well, today, like within the last 6 months, what I've been hearing a growing buzz around, so buzzword-driven, is agile DevOps. Everything's going to be agile DevOps. And previous to that, I was hearing everything's going to be cloud. How many of you have been hearing agile DevOps? And that agile DevOps is going to be everywhere. Now, I'm not saying you can't do agile, and certainly if you're going to do agile, it's really good to couple it with DevOps. But putting agile for everything everywhere makes absolutely no sense, and that would be buzzword-driven architecture, where they get excited about something really cool. It's not to say that this technology is bad in and of itself, but where you have this blanket decision to sort of push it out there everywhere, it's just, you know, crazy making. And as architects, we kind of step back and go, well, is this the best way to kind of take advantage of this technology? Let's move on to the next one, detailed enterprise modeling. Oh, now, I don't know of you guys, how many of you are actually architects and are finding yourselves having to go through sort of a checklist of all these documents you have to complete before you present it to the architecture review board, and unless you have this, like, you know, huge manual of, you know, dozens and dozens of documents and diagrams, you don't actually pass it. So we have architecture models that are overly detailed, and that you provided information and diagrams that really are only being used for this review and don't have a real audience in terms of your stakeholders. That arguably you should be modeling only to communicate. If I don't have an audience in mind, then why am I creating this? And if the only audience is the architecture review board, it begs the question of why am I spending so much time doing this modeling instead of actually doing the architecture work itself? And having all of these different models, documents and diagrams and things like that, it makes the architecture so difficult to actually interpret. How many of you are finding yourselves spending too much time in your architecture work and just doing the documentation piece of it? I'm noticing a good comment here from Mohammed. When board members expect details, it's difficult to explain to them. Yeah. So what in actuality are they gaining out of having you spend all these hours going into very specific pieces of detail, when in fact, as an architect, the modeling that I should be doing should be sufficient to be able to hand it off to those that are going to implement it? And that it's meant to be consumed by those that are going to be supporting it, and those that are actually going to be building it, and those that are going to be using it. If I think of my stakeholders and grouping them into one of those three groups, I should be limiting my modeling to have effective communication to them, and that should be sufficient. And where do you draw the line? Now, Mohammed, that's a good question. Let me answer that, but I just want to take a look here. The comment here from Anthony, it's often because documentation is not done when the system is designed or updated when it's implemented. Yeah, so when you have it and you're sort of backpedaling to get the information in there. Oh, Vince, thank you for that. Viewpoints and perspective approach helps. Right, so if we work with views and viewpoints, this is a standard basically from IEEE, there is a standard out there for views and viewpoints on how to actually document your architecture. And the emphasis in this standard, working with viewpoints, is that anything I create has to have a stakeholder audience, and that what I'm creating is addressing that stakeholder group a particular set of concerns. And it's when I have that audience in mind, addressing their concerns, that what I create in terms of documentation is consumable by them, then this becomes documentation that's meaningful, that will be maintained because it's being used. That's how you want to draw the line. So the practice of views and viewpoints come in. So when I look at detailed enterprise modeling, I start thinking in those terms. I just want to highlight something to you, that newer organizations that have been able to come in after, like a lot of you I'm sure work for large corporations that have been around for decades, and they have what I would label from an architecture perspective an antiquated approach to doing business, that when you look at other organizations that are newer, they've been able to kind of set things up differently for architects. And the example that I would encourage you to take a look at would be the Netflix case study. And a lot of the architecture work being done there is actually not getting modeled at all. So they're able to address things, and if everybody understands what they're doing, they're not sitting there retroactively kind of writing up the documentation only to put it on a shelf and nobody looks at it again. I do want sufficient documentation that everybody knows what's going on, and if a new person comes in, that they can quickly come up to speed, but I want to be very selective about what that should be. I don't want to be spending a lot of time creating this exhaustive list of documentation only to be able to check out on the box that I did this list. I want to be asking the question, is this going to be something that is meaningful to those that are using the architecture, to those that are supporting the architecture, to those that are implementing the architecture? And if the answer is no, then I'm not going to create it. That would be the ideal. All right, so let's move on to the next two. How about strive for perfection? So this is kind of the reverse of one of the comments that was mentioned before, where there's no planning. That's bad. The reverse to that is having too much planning. How much time are you spending just talking about it, experimenting with it, tinkering, having meetings, and meanwhile you're going, you know what, we should have started this yesterday and we're still kind of sitting on the fence about this. And then in the meantime, while you're trying to decide, are we going to do this? So this is kind of like the reverse of doing that buzzword driven where you act on things without thinking. This is thinking too long, and what happens in the meantime is architecture's just getting band-aids. So you're just sort of, you know, fixing things or adding things haphazardly while you're trying to figure out the best approach. Even though you have a notion, I know what would be good right now, but we've got to have meetings to discuss this ad nauseum. How many of you find yourself in that kind of situation? Where you feel like all you're doing is slapping band-aids on the architecture, and there'd be a better way if we could just stop and actually act on what we know would be good rather than being frozen. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be enough to get us a step closer to our vision. I'm not seeing any of you actually seeing this complaint, so it would seem that most of you today are more in the previous group where there's a lot of action without thinking as opposed to inaction because there's too much thinking. How about this one? Stuck in the weeds. Now, often if you are in project-driven architecture, you're more likely to experience the stuck in the weeds. But here's the scenario. Here you are. You started out, you have a certain level of, typically architects follow this career path. You started out with a certain level of technical skill, whether it was doing maybe network or systems, maybe databases, maybe applications. You became very proficient at it. You became the lead, so maybe the lead application developer or the senior DBA. And then because you were so good at it, you got pushed up and promoted to being an architect. And hopefully you're excited about being an architect and you learn about what it is to be an architect, and you should be able to hand it over to the technical leads in order to implement it. But then you're finding that you're having to take your architecture hat off and put your technical lead hat back on where you're not able to make that break and you get sucked into actually doing the implementation. So here you are, the application architect, who's turning around and actually being one of the developers or the application designer and developer on the team. That being one example. How many of you have a sense that you're stuck in the weeds? Yeah, we've got a big yep on that one. Anyone else finding themselves stuck in the weeds, where you move from architecture going into design and doing? Isn't that always the case? Interesting comment. So I would say that it's very, very common, but this is definitely not the desired. And I have had the privilege of being in organizations that have addressed this anti-pattern to free up architects to do architecture by building up the technical teams, like the designers, and then those that would be implementing it, building them up to have a good understanding of that handshake between architecture work and implementing it, so that architects are not stuck in the weeds. So I'm just wondering, would you like to actually be freed from having to be sucked into implementing everything that you actually specify in your architecture? Would that be a good thing? So it can sometimes be, by the way, with stuck in the weeds, that as much as it may be a failing in terms of the technical leads not being able to understand enough of architecture to properly interpret and implement the architecture specifications, it could be that architects have been assigned the role of architecture when what they really want is to have stayed in that technical arena. You still want to get your hands dirty. So it may be the cause of this may not be clear, and it's worth examining. All right, last two that I've highlighted here. Tomorrow suffers from today. Now, I think there was one of the comments that was brought up a little bit earlier about not being able to look at the future. So I think that was you, Mohammed, who was saying not looking at the future. Well, this is exactly what that is. You're so busy just solving today's problems, you're being really reactive instead of proactive. So a reactive architecture practice is basically today is dictating the failures of tomorrow. So this is how we do it here, rather than being open to changing. Maybe there's a better way to do it if we could let go of all of this this particular approach to be able to leverage some of the new architectures that are out there. Notice that another thing that comes out of this anti-pattern, let me just highlight it for you, is that the current state is being described in like low-level details, minutia, rather than focusing more on what could be done. We're focusing exhaustively on how we do it. So we want to improve the business, and what we would like to do as architects, what we should do as architects, is start with that vision. Do you have an enterprise architecture vision? That enterprise architecture vision should be the architecture that supports the strategic vision of your organization. So I'm sure in your company, they've basically spelled it out. This is the direction we're going. This is what we see our business being. These are the capabilities that we want to have. Enterprise architecture needs to look at that vision, the strategic vision of the organization, and actually then articulate, well, what does that mean in terms of the architecture? What do we have to have in the architecture to be able to support that vision? And then with that enterprise architecture vision, do you have the solution architecture stepping stones to express that? And then while you're working on the different architectures across the domains? Are you building it with that sensitivity that how I solve this particular problem here has to align with what we want it to be tomorrow? So how many of you are actually suffering today, like how tomorrow is suffering from today, or where you're actually being proactive? So is anybody actually not experiencing this anti-pattern? Or are you experiencing it? How many of you are finding that we should change the way we're doing it, but you keep getting stuck because everybody's saying, no, this is how we do it here. I know we could change and it would be better, but we're not going to because we have to follow these steps, and you get bogged down into these antiquated processes. How many of you find yourself in that boat? Yeah. So we've got a few of you actually commenting that, yeah, you're living this one out. You can have that vision of what would be ideal, but it does take a shift. We're going to take a look at how we might address that. But the first step is recognizing that if you're experiencing it, this is considered an architecture anti-pattern. And the architecture program, in identifying it, needs to have a plan in place to correct this. All right, moving on to the next one, politically oriented architecture. Oh, look at this. Office politics are allowed to shape the enterprise. So the symptom would be you've got technology proliferation, broken processes, fragmented data. It's basically disjointed. Arguably, if you've got silos happening, you probably have this, right? Where this is mine, and we live in this world, and we really aren't sharing, and we're not connecting, and we're not thinking outside of our own particular line of business, or however those silos are expressed. So if you're living in that silo world, no doubt, like silos come about because it's politically oriented. This is mine and I'm not sharing. How many of you actually see yourselves there? Yeah, we've got an enthusiastic, definitely. Everyone's making their own decisions. They're owning it. Now, one of the challenges, and thank you, Jason, for adding that in, one of the challenges with this one tends to center around the funding model for architecture. You basically got lines of businesses that have their budget and they want to build something, and if what they're building is going to be used by another line of business, like a different kingdom, it begs the question of, well, if we paid for it, they shouldn't get it for free. So how are we actually going to reinterpret this expense such that it can break down those silos? Now, there's been a lot of work. There was a lot of work done when we were doing service-oriented architecture when it first came on the scene, so between 2000 and 2005. This was a big problem, and there have been proven ways to actually address it. You don't have to be doing SOA to actually look at how SOA solved that particular problem in order to take it across other architecture exercises. So definitely we want to get out of that trap. All right, so let's get into solving this problem, ways to prevent the failure. So the first step here is understanding that the more familiar you are with anti-patterns, the more likely you are to see how you could make your architecture program more successful. Recognizing that if you see the symptoms of those anti-patterns, it should speak to you that architecture can solve this problem and make things better. So the first thing is obviously get to know the anti-patterns. So, and in getting to know them, being able to recognize, oh, we're suffering from that anti-pattern. So now I know that this is not the way things should be. I think there was the comment about being stuck in the weeds and isn't that the way it's supposed to be? And arguably we're saying no. So if you're finding yourself going from being an architect to being that programmer again, we're telling you that that's a proven way to not get the most out of your architecture program. and there have been organizations that have successfully broken that pattern. Now, each anti-pattern reflects a different set of issues. So after you diagnose, what we want to do is know, well, how do I fix it? So what is the course of action I need to take in order to stop this anti-pattern, to get from an anti-pattern to a pattern? Now, when you look at documented, well-known anti-patterns, what they offer is not only saying, hey, look, this is a problem and here are the symptoms, but they also provide you with a way to fix it. So what you want to do, again, is look at these documented anti-patterns and you can see the course of action. Let's actually take a look at what some of the proposed treatments are for the anti-patterns we looked at. So with buzzword-driven architecture, so know that the decision to add new technology should be done by people who have the expertise. So it's fine if people get excited about something like agile DevOps, but it should be handed over to the architecture teams so that they can call up the appropriate experts to then make the decision about if this is going to work for your organization, and if so, in what way. So when, as architects, we're being told, hey, we're going to do this, the architect should be asking the question, what are you hoping to achieve? And by breaking it down into the goals, then we can move away from being driven by the buzzwords and get down into what are the capabilities needed so we can then propose the best way to achieve it. When we look at detailed enterprise modeling, remember that modeling is a communication tool, and I think it was already highlighted. Lean on the practice of views and viewpoints. And when you do that, it means that any of the models you create have an audience in mind. It's for this particular document is for these stakeholders who have these concerns. And I can't create or model anything unless I can answer that question. It's for these stakeholders with these concerns in order to communicate so that they can participate in the architecture in an effective way. The strive for perfection. So one of the other things is that you have to understand that architecture is never done, it's never perfect, and that architecture is meant to evolve. So what we want to do is emphasize one of the core architectural concepts in that architecture should be sufficient, complete, and primitive. Primitive means that it's addressing the needs, no more, no less. We don't want to over-engineer, right? And that's part of what's happening with perfection. And that we also, in anticipating that what we're doing is a step towards fulfilling our end goal, is that how I build this needs to allow for improvements over time. So make your architecture modifiable. So as an architect, I'm one of my stakeholders, and one of my primary requirements is that the architecture is modifiable, that I can pull something out in favor of something better when we get into a situation that affords us that. Now, I'm noticing the time. We're coming up to the top of the hour. We do have a few more slides to go through. So if you do have to leave, just know that you can get the slide deck and you can follow up with emails. But I'm going to continue until we finish this. So hopefully that technical interruption, that you're able to stay for another 10-15 minutes. All right, for stuck in the weeds. Now the key thing here to solve this problem, so going back to the one comment, isn't this the way it's supposed to be? What we want is to have what an architect is and is not. So clear roles and responsibilities spelled out. And that then the architects handing over to the technical leads, the designers and implementers of your architecture, that they also have clear roles and responsibilities, and that you have it well defined how you're doing that handshake, so that the architect can step back and be supportive in working with those that are implementing it, but that they don't have to stop being architects, that their focus on it will be architectural, not implementation. So that means that those technical teams have to have the appropriate training, and the resources so that they know how to work with architects. So architects can be free to say, I know that you know what you're doing and that you understand my instructions and that I can be available for critical points in the implementation, but it's not my job to do that. So clear roles and responsibilities. So that actually falls back to your architecture program. Does it have a good governance? Because good governance would be providing this. So not only defining the roles and responsibilities, but having the appropriate procedures in place to make that happen. And part of good governance, in addition to doing that, is providing the education to address that. So there may be a transition period where you're building up those technical teams, and while that's happening, you're still somewhat stuck in the weeds, but you can have a sense that you're being pulled out so that you can be free to just focus on architecture concerns. Tomorrow suffers from today, so you remember this one. So we do definitely want to be thinking about the future. We want, again, to go back to that vision. And that, of course, we want to be experimenting with it and aligning it. So notice a couple of things that we're going to do is we're going to work with alternate techniques to test the possibilities. So work with change cases. So capture good ideas. Doesn't mean you have to act on them now, but then we can know about the possibility of that happening and when. Making sure you're working with architecture use cases and having that picture in mind means that what we're doing today is going to line up with what that architecture is that we're trying to build. And certainly doing some prototyping and prototyping to help us know, again, a little bit about what we could be building. And then getting down to the nitty-gritty is restricting the modeling of the current state, that the current state, what you have in its model, should only be sufficient to align the components up to what you want to have. So it's contextualized, but sorry, I just had some announcement going through my headset. Moving on to this one, politically oriented architecture. Now this one here is making sure that, and again, we're trying to break down the silos with this one so that the architecture becomes foundational to all the lines of businesses, and where we can share, we do. Right? And that requires us to have the powers that be help us creating that funding model where we can allow different projects to actually recognize that there's a certain piece of this that's going to be shared out and that the amount that they have to invest in it is appropriate to what their benefits are getting back. Again, there's a lot of different approaches, and I would encourage, if you're in that situation, to take a look at service-oriented architecture funding models to give you some ideas about how we break down those silos to start redirecting environments that tend to have this approach, that kingdom approach. All right, now, it's all well and good to say this is what we should do to fix it, but what happens when your reality just does not allow you to act on a lot of those prescribed treatments? So what if you can't fix it? So a lot of what I was just highlighting there assume that you're actually in a position to direct that behavior, right, so that you can affect change. So working with these anti-patterns, you can sort of have a sense that I can see this problem and I know what I want to do, but I can't stop it. Right? It's just so powerful. Nobody's really listening to me, or nobody's listening to us, right? External forces are really strong. How many of you have a sense of that you kind of know what you should be doing, but you just can't make it happen? How many of you are in that boat? Yeah. So a number of you are. Yeah. So I'm going to highlight maybe the baby steps, as much as you'd like to get up, walk, and run, and get into a fast car and move quickly. Like, you can see that that's what should happen. It may be that we have to think about this more like, you know, the snowflake. That the snowflake makes a snowball, makes the snowman, makes the avalanche. But it does start with just that snowflake. So let's identify for us what those small steps are. Now, often knowing what the end result should be, you may try to jump into that deep end right away. And unfortunately, there's always a resistance to change. Like 80% of the problems you're facing is because of people. It's not because we don't know how to do this correctly in architecture. It's not because the technology can't do it. It's because of the way people approach things and the way people do things. So we can experience defeat when we try to change too much. There is a saturation point, and a lot of this is going to be the organization's culture. And understanding your organization's culture will be the first step in you understanding, well, what is it going to take to start the process of making the shift? So having the goal in mind of what it should be, you want to be thinking about what are the small little things I could do today to get some improvement. And it's these small wins that can help build some momentum. Definitely emphasize the fact that why you can't get out of a particular anti-pattern experience is typically, like I said, it's the 80-20 rule, is no doubt 80% an issue with people. So we want to emphasize that you want to be talking about it, you want to be educating your stakeholders, you want to collaborate with other architects and with other business people. Identify those that are going to be your sponsors in a sense, those that have power and influence that are buying it in. And if you don't, you want to work your way up that ladder of finding and identifying and educating and winning over people, right? So we want to get stakeholders to understand what we want to do. So communication. Another thing is what I call the wiki approach. So this is a pattern to address the global approach to anti-patterns. So the wiki approach, like think of it with wiki. If there's something missing on Wikipedia, you can go in and put in, hey, we need something that's talking about this, and this is what I know now. Nobody's punished for starting up a wiki entry. In fact, you are going to be rewarded for it, but there's an expectation that others can contribute, update, correct anything that's on that wiki page. So something is better than nothing. So at least try something. If it doesn't work, don't become an anti-pattern. Stop and try something else. So something is better than nothing. Just get the ball rolling. And understand that it's going to be basically done over time. And as we evangelize the corrections that we want and getting more people on board, eventually we will have enough power to fight back those waves. So improving as you go. So this is take a wiki approach. Think about if I just do things better, that will be an improvement. And if I can get somebody else kind of say, hey, this is what I'm doing, and they go, yeah, that's working for me too, I'm going to do it with you, but hey, together we've come up with yet another thing we can do to make it better. Right? So take that wiki approach. How many of you have heard of doing the wiki approach? Or think that you could actually see a way of applying that to just your job as a way of starting to build a corrective action to an anti-pattern you're experiencing? How many of you have a sense that you know how to act on that? Or that you would like to try that? All right, so food for thought. Now another thing that's come up, now don't confuse this, agile architecture. This is about going beyond the idea of being an architect on an agile project. This is about architecture programs leveraging the principles of agile for software, leveraging them for how you approach your architecture practice. So working in an agile manner, so doing architecture in an iterative fashion, and that allows you to kind of go, this worked, this didn't. We'll fix what didn't, and we'll keep doing what does work. And that agile emphasizes collaboration. So this is about, again, a lot of the problems we have is because people don't understand what's needed. So let's be more collaborative and more communicative in educating stakeholders appropriately so they can participate the right way. And that also agile is looking at having these quick wins. So if we're doing a lot of software releases in an agile project, we're thinking architecturally, what would be the stepping stones? How can I make it, an architecture that's going to take several years? We have transition architectures that we achieve maybe at best 6 months, maybe probably more like 12 months. And with an agile architecture approach, we're thinking, well, what could I achieve in a month or in 2 months, at most 3 months, so that we're actually getting people to see architecture value quicker, right? So you can consider some of the work that's being done in this field of agile architecture. So on that note, just know that we do have courses that would allow you to dive into more of the practical hands-on of how to actually get this done. We do have the architecture training that gives you tools and techniques to make your visions for your architecture a reality. We also have an agile architecture training, a full curriculum that can help you not only address agile architecture in the context of being architects on an agile project, but taking it to that next level of how you can approach architecture in that agile way so that you can actually better address the anti-patterns. So in summary, we have proven ways to fail, but remember, for it to be an anti-pattern, it means that you're repeating that behavior and there's a better option out there. So being knowledgeable of the anti-patterns, remember that well-documented anti-patterns are basically saying, I've been there, it didn't work, and this is how I fixed it. So if you recognized any of those anti-patterns, just know that there is a treatment for it, and that the treatment may be a little lofty in terms of it being attainable, but then we have the two approaches, the wiki approach and the agile approach, that allow us to take the small steps to get to a point of being able to have the full treatment. So having the corrective measures in place to actually get success starts with a familiarity with anti-patterns. So again, my email address is christine.thompson@webagesolutions.com. I want to thank you very much for your attendance today and taking time out of your busy schedules. I trust that you found this useful and food for thought. If you have any comments or questions, again, feel free to email me. And the slide deck is available. If you haven't already downloaded it, just go to WebAge Solutions. Just use your contact that you used to access this webinar to actually get a copy of that. I'll stay on the line for a few minutes here, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to do so now. For those of you that have to leave, I just wish you a very good day. Thank you very much. I can see some thank yous and goodbyes there online. Good. All right, have a good day. So there's just a few of you left. Any of you have any questions? Any comments? I'll be shutting down the webinar in a minute here. Okay, I'm going to be closing down the webinar. Oh, I can see a comment. Technology always evolves, and with that, architecture tends to be re-architecture over time. Absolutely. And this is that fact. Thank you, Lakshmi, if I said that right. That comment is why we've seen this emphasis now on trying to approach things in a more agile way. Arguably, architecture has always had to be responsive and adaptable, modifiable. But how we actually translate that into the architecture practice, we're seeing some really good new things coming out under the label of agile architecture. So are you actually able to experience that? That's so good. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a sign that you've got a good architecture practice. That certainly, as you as a professional in the field, but I'm trusting that that's also reflected with your in your architecture program. I'm just wondering, are you formally using Antipatterns as one of the tools for helping you achieve better results? That's good. Yeah, you're quite welcome. I hope you have a really good day. And if you have any other follow-up questions or comments, feel free to email me. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I'm going to be ending this webinar. And again, feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments that you would like some follow-up on. And I wish you a very good day. Thank you for your time.